March 19, 1945. While American newspapers celebrated Allied victories across Europe, a different kind of battle was being fought in the bodies of young German women who had once served the Third Reich. These were not battles of bullets and bombs, but the slow, agonizing war against starvation that had become as familiar to them as breathing. In the final months of the war, as Germany's infrastructure crumbled under relentless Allied bombing, food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The women of the German auxiliary forces, who had served as radio operators, clerks, and nurses, found themselves eating less and less until hunger became not just a sensation but a constant companion, a weight that pressed against their ribs and clouded their thoughts with a gray fog of exhaustion. 22-year-old Marguerite Schulz had not seen real meat in 18 months. She could still remember the taste, or thought she could, though increasingly she wondered if her memory was playing tricks on her, inventing flavors her body desperately craved. She had been captured near the Rhine in early February, along with 37 other women from her communications unit. They had been retreating eastward, trying to stay ahead of American forces, surviving on whatever they could scavenge from abandoned farms and bombed-out villages. A piece of moldy bread shared among 3 women. Potato peels boiled into a thin, tasteless soup. Once, a handful of dried beans that had seemed like a feast until the stomach cramps came hours later, their bodies too weakened to properly digest even that meager meal. The other women in Marguerite's unit shared similar stories. Anna Fischer, just 19 years old, had watched her weight drop until her uniform hung on her frame like a tent. Her cheekbones had become sharp angles in her face, her eyes seeming too large for her hollowed features. Elizabeth Hartmann, who had once been known for her robust health and infectious laughter, now moved slowly, conserving every ounce of energy, her laughter long since silenced by the gnawing emptiness in her belly. They had learned to stop talking about food. In the early days of their hunger, they had shared memories of meals from before the war, of Sunday dinners with roasted chicken and dumplings, of Christmas feasts with glazed ham and sweet pastries. But those conversations had become torture, making the hunger worse, so they had stopped. They moved through their days in silence, their thoughts consumed by the singular hope of finding something, anything, to quiet the constant ache. When the Americans had finally caught up with them, Marguerite had felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief that the running was over, that perhaps in captivity there might at least be food. Terror because everything they had been told about American soldiers suggested that prisoners could expect cruelty, perhaps even execution. As they were loaded onto transport trucks, bound for an unknown destination, Marguerite touched the hollow of her stomach and wondered if she would ever feel full again, or if hunger had become a permanent part of who she was now. The transport truck rumbled through the Georgia countryside for what felt like days, though Marguerite later learned it had only been 14 hours. The 38 German women sat pressed together on wooden benches, their bodies swaying with each bump in the road. Through gaps in the canvas covering, they caught glimpses of a landscape that seemed impossibly lush and green compared to the bombed-out wasteland they had left behind in Europe. Fields stretched endlessly, untouched by war, and occasionally they passed farms with actual livestock grazing peacefully in pastures. The sight of fat cattle and healthy chickens felt almost obscene to women who had watched their own country's animals systematically slaughtered and consumed as Germany's food situation became increasingly desperate. When the truck finally stopped and the canvas was pulled back, bright southern sunlight flooded in, making them squint and shield their eyes. American soldiers motioned for them to climb down, their faces neutral and professional. Marguerite's legs trembled as she stepped onto solid ground, weakness from months of malnutrition making even simple movements difficult. She looked around at what would be their new home, at least temporarily. Camp Gordon sprawled before them, a sprawling complex of buildings and fences that looked nothing like the crude facilities they had expected. The buildings appeared solid and well-maintained. Guards walked patrol routes with an efficiency that spoke of routine rather than chaos. A female American officer approached the group, her uniform crisp and her bearing confident. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Patricia Morrison, and to the German women's surprise, she spoke to them in accented but comprehensible German. She had studied the language at university before the war, she explained, never imagining she would one day use it to process enemy prisoners. Lieutenant Morrison's eyes moved over the assembled women, and Marguerite saw something flicker across her face, recognition perhaps, or concern. The American officer was clearly noting their gaunt faces, their ill-fitting uniforms that hung loosely on frames that had once been fuller, the way several women swayed slightly on their feet from exhaustion and hunger. The processing began with medical examinations. A camp doctor, an older man, with kind eyes and gentle hands, checked each woman systematically. Marguerite heard him speaking quietly to his assistant in English, his tone worried. She caught a few words, weight, malnutrition, severe, and realized he was documenting the physical toll their service and captivity had taken. When it was her turn, he placed a stethoscope against her chest and listened, then had her step onto a scale. He wrote something in his notes, his expression grave. Through an interpreter, he asked her when she had last eaten a full meal. Marguerite tried to remember and realized she could not. Weeks? Months? Time had blurred together in the final chaotic days before their capture. After medical processing, they were led to a barracks that would serve as their quarters. It was clean, with actual beds and blankets. As Marguerite sat on the edge of her assigned cot, running her hand over the rough wool blanket, Lieutenant Morrison appeared in the doorway with an announcement that would change everything. Lieutenant Morrison stood in the doorway of the barracks, her posture straight, but her expression softer than it had been during processing. The 38 German women had settled onto their cots, exhausted from the journey and the medical examinations. Some were already lying down, their bodies surrendering to the fatigue that had become their constant state. Others sat upright, watching the American officer with wary eyes, wondering what would come next. Marguerite remained on the edge of her cot, her hands folded in her lap, trying to appear composed despite the weakness that made her limbs feel like lead. The lieutenant cleared her throat and began speaking in her careful German. She explained the basic rules of the camp, the daily schedule, the expectations for their conduct. The women listened with the practiced attention of soldiers, accustomed to following orders, even if those orders now came from their captors. But then Lieutenant Morrison said something that made every woman in the room go completely still. "Dinner will be served in the mess hall at 1800 hours, she announced. "Tonight we are having beef stew with vegetables, fresh bread, and coffee." The words hung in the air like something from a dream or a hallucination. Several women exchanged glances, certain they had misheard or misunderstood. Beef? Real beef? Anna Fisher, the 19-year-old who had become nothing but sharp angles and hollow cheeks, raised a trembling hand. "Excuse me, Lieutenant," she said in halting German, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you say beef?" Lieutenant Morrison nodded, seemingly unaware of the magnitude of what she had just announced. "Yes, beef stew. The camp cooks prepare it every Thursday. There will be plenty for everyone." She paused, noticing the stunned expressions on the women's faces. "Is something wrong?" Marguerite found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. "Lieutenant, we have not seen meat, real meat, in many months. Some of us not since 1943. The American officer's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching shock. She had known intellectually that Germany was suffering from severe food shortages, but seeing these emaciated women and hearing them speak about years without meat made the reality hit differently. "I see," she said quietly. "Well, you will have meat tonight, and every meal here will include adequate nutrition. That is the standard for all prisoners in American custody according to the Geneva Convention." She delivered this information matter-of-factly, as if proper feeding of prisoners was simply obvious policy, nothing remarkable. After Lieutenant Morrison left, the barracks erupted into whispered conversations. Some women insisted it must be a trick, a cruel joke, or perhaps some kind of test. Others argued that Americans were known to be wealthy and wasteful. Maybe they really did have enough food to feed prisoners beef stew. Elizabeth Hartman, who had not spoken much since their capture, began to cry silently, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I do not even remember how to eat properly anymore," she whispered. What if my stomach cannot handle it? The question hung unanswered as the women waited, watching the afternoon light fade, counting the hours until 1800. When 1800 hours arrived, the German women walked to the mess hall, in a silent, tentative group. Their military training kept them in formation, but their steps were slow and uncertain, as if approaching something that might vanish if they moved too quickly. The mess hall was a large wooden structure with rows of long tables and benches. Other prisoners, male German soldiers from different units, were already seated and eating. The women noticed immediately that the men looked healthier than they had expected, their faces not quite as hollow as they remembered seeing in the final days before capture. American soldiers gestured for the women to form a line. At the serving station, camp cooks, most of them American enlisted men, stood behind large metal containers from which steam rose in fragrant clouds. Marguerite was near the front of the line, and as she approached, the smell hit her with physical force. Rich, meaty, savory, the aroma of beef stew made her head swim and her knees weaken. She gripped her metal tray tighter, afraid she might drop it. The cook, a heavy-set man with flour dusting his apron, smiled at her and said something in English she did not understand. Then he ladled an enormous portion of stew onto her tray, the ladle coming up heavy with chunks of actual beef, carrots, potatoes, and thick gravy. Beside the stew, another cook placed 2 thick slices of white bread, real bread with a golden crust, still warm from the oven. A third station offered coffee, dark and strong, poured into a tin cup. Marguerite stood frozen, staring at her tray. It held more food than she had seen in a single place in 2 years. The beef chunks were the size of her thumb, tender and swimming in rich broth. The vegetables were whole and plentiful. The bread was not the sawdust-mixed ersatz bread they had eaten in Germany, but real wheat bread that gave slightly when she pressed it with her thumb. She found a seat at one of the tables designated for the women. Anna sat beside her, Elizabeth across from them. All 3 women stared at their trays, none of them moving to eat. Around them, other women were having the same reaction, frozen in disbelief, afraid to trust what was in front of them. "It is real," Anna whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I can smell it. It is real beef." Marguerite picked up her spoon with a shaking hand. She dipped it into the stew, watching the gravy coat the metal. She brought it to her lips and paused, closing her eyes. Then she tasted it. The flavor exploded across her tongue, so rich and complex after months of bland, meager rations that she almost sobbed. The beef was tender and seasoned. The gravy was thick with fat and herbs. The carrots were sweet. She swallowed and felt the warmth travel down her throat into her empty stomach. She took another spoonful, then another, and suddenly she could not stop. Around her, other women were having the same experience, eating with desperate intensity, tears streaming down their faces as they consumed food they had thought they might never taste again in their lives. Marguerite had eaten perhaps half of her stew when her stomach began to cramp. The pain was sharp and immediate, her body protesting after months of near starvation. She pressed a hand against her abdomen and forced herself to slow down, taking smaller bites, chewing more carefully. Around the table, other women were experiencing similar distress. Their bodies, adapted to survival on minimal nutrition, were struggling to process the sudden abundance of rich food. Anna had gone pale, her spoon hovering halfway to her mouth, clearly fighting nausea. Elizabeth had stopped eating entirely, her hand clutched to her midsection, breathing slowly through her nose. An American soldier, a young corporal with red hair and freckles, noticed their distress. He approached the table and said something in English, his tone concerned. When none of the women responded, he held up one finger in a wait gesture and hurried away. He returned moments later with Lieutenant Morrison, who knelt beside their table, her eyes moving from face to face, assessing their condition. "You are eating too quickly," she said gently in German. "Your bodies need time to adjust. When you have been without proper food for so long, you must eat slowly, in smaller amounts, or you will become ill." She signaled to one of the cooks, and he brought over a pitcher of water in clean glasses. "Drink slowly," Lieutenant Morrison instructed. "Small sips between bites, and if you cannot finish, that is acceptable. There will be food again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day you are here. You do not need to eat everything now." The concept was almost impossible to grasp. Food tomorrow? And the next day? In Germany, you ate everything you could when it was available, because you never knew when the next meal might come. Saving food for later was a luxury they had forgotten existed. Marguerite forced herself to slow down, taking a small bite of bread, then a sip of water, then another careful spoonful of stew. The cramping in her stomach gradually eased. She watched as the American cooks moved through the mess hall, checking on the prisoners, offering more bread to those who wanted it, refilling coffee cups. The red-haired corporal returned to their table carrying a small basket of saltine crackers. Through gestures and simple words, he indicated that if the stew was too rich, they could try the plain crackers instead, which would be easier on their stomachs. What struck Marguerite most was not just the abundance of food, but the care being taken to ensure they could eat it safely. These were enemy soldiers, Americans who had every reason to hate them, yet they were treating the German women with a gentleness that defied everything they had been taught. The corporal noticed that Anna had barely touched her stew and was looking increasingly unwell. Without being asked, he brought her a cup of weak broth instead, something lighter that her stomach might tolerate better. Anna looked up at him with confused gratitude, unable to understand why this enemy soldier cared whether she ate or not. As the meal continued, Marguerite found herself able to eat about 3/4 of what had been served to her. When she finally set down her spoon, feeling fuller than she had in years, she looked at her tray and saw something that made her breath catch. There was still food left. 3 weeks had passed since that first meal of beef stew, and the German women had settled into a routine that still felt surreal. Breakfast brought oatmeal with sugar and milk, real milk that was white and creamy. Lunch was sandwiches with meat and cheese, sometimes accompanied by fruit, actual apples and oranges that the women ate slowly, savoring every bite. Dinner varied, but there was always protein, always vegetables, always enough. Marguerite had gained 6 pounds, her face beginning to fill out, the sharpest angles of her cheekbones softening. Anna's hair, which had been brittle and dull, was starting to regain some shine. Elizabeth had stopped moving like an old woman, her steps coming with more energy and confidence. But the physical transformation brought with it a growing sense of unease, a guilt that settled over the women like a heavy blanket. It started when the first letters from Germany began arriving, processed through the International Red Cross and delivered by Lieutenant Morrison. Marguerite's letter was from her younger sister, Heidi, still in Hamburg. The paper was thin and cheap, the handwriting shaky, and the words made Marguerite's full stomach turn to stone. "Dearest Greet," the letter began. "I hope this finds you safe, wherever you are. Mama died in February during the bombing. We buried her in the garden because the cemetery is too far and we are too weak to carry her. Father survived, but he grows thinner every day. We have no coal for heat, and the ration cards give us almost nothing now. Yesterday our allowance was 100 grams of bread and a small potato. Father gave me his portion. I tried to refuse, but he insisted." The letter continued with details that grew increasingly desperate. Her sister described how they boiled grass and tree bark to make soup, how they searched through rubble for anything edible, how children in the neighborhood had stopped playing because they no longer had the energy. "The Americans bomb us every day," Heidi wrote. "But honestly, Gret, I think more people are dying from hunger than from the bombs. Frau Schneider from downstairs simply did not wake up last week. The doctor said her heart gave out, but we all know she starved to death. Please, if you can, if there is any way, send food. Even a little would save lives. Your loving sister, Heidi." Marguerite sat on her cot, the letter trembling in her hands, tears streaming down her face. Around the barracks, other women were reading similar letters, and similar sounds of anguish filled the air. Anna's letter was from her mother in Berlin, describing how they were eating wallpaper paste mixed with water because it contained traces of flour. Elizabeth's brother wrote from Munich about neighbors who had resorted to eating rats and pigeons to survive. The contrast between their current reality and the reality of their loved ones back home was unbearable. While they ate beef stew and fresh bread, their families were starving. While they gained weight and regained strength, their mothers and fathers and siblings grew weaker and closer to death. That evening at dinner, Marguerite could barely eat. She stared at the meatloaf and mashed potatoes on her tray, thinking about her sister's 100 grams of bread, about her father giving away his portion. She thought about Frau Schneider, who had simply not woken up, her body finally surrendering to prolonged starvation. Anna sat beside her, also staring at her untouched food. "How can we eat this?" Anna whispered. "Knowing they have nothing?" Elizabeth, normally the strongest among them, had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The guilt became a physical presence that sat between the women and their meals. What had initially been miraculous, the abundance of American food, now felt like a moral burden they carried with every bite. Marguerite found herself eating mechanically, without pleasure, the taste of beef stew now mixed with the bitter flavor of shame. She had written back to her sister immediately, but what could she say? That she was eating 3 full meals a day while their father starved himself to keep Heidi alive? The words felt obscene, so she had simply written that she was safe and praying for them, leaving out everything else. Lieutenant Morrison noticed the change in the women almost immediately. The mess hall, which had been filled with the sounds of grateful eating just weeks before, had become quiet and tense. Women left food on their trays, picking at meals they would have killed for just a month ago. Some requested smaller portions. Others tried to save bread in their pockets, though they had nowhere to send it and no way to preserve it. The lieutenant called Marguerite to her office one afternoon, concerned about the sudden shift in morale and the regression in the women's recovery. Through the window, spring sunshine illuminated the Georgia landscape, making everything look peaceful and abundant, a cruel contrast to the conversation they were about to have. "You received letters from home," Lieutenant Morrison said, not as a question but as a statement. She had processed the mail herself and had undoubtedly noticed the thin paper, the desperate handwriting, the evidence of a country collapsing into starvation. Marguerite nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. The lieutenant sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful and troubled. "I can only imagine how difficult it must be," she said carefully, "to have enough when your loved ones have nothing. But Marguerite, you must understand that your starvation would not feed them. Your suffering here would not ease their suffering there." The logic was sound, but it did nothing to ease the emotional torment. Marguerite finally found her voice, speaking slowly in her improving English. "My sister, she eats 100 grams of bread. One day, my father gives his food to her. He is dying so she can live a little longer." Her voice broke on the last words. "And I eat beef and potatoes and fruit. How is this right? How can I swallow food knowing this?" Lieutenant Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried its own weight of sadness. "It is not right," she admitted. "None of this war is right. But the question is not whether you eat or starve here. The question is what you do with the strength that food gives you." She pulled out a folder from her desk drawer and opened it, revealing forms and documents. "The Red Cross has programs," she explained. "Ways for prisoners to contribute to relief efforts. You can write letters that will be distributed to encourage donations. You can share information about conditions in Germany that might motivate aid organizations. Some prisoners have been allowed to work in packaging stations, preparing care packages for shipment." She looked directly at Marguerite. "You can use your strength to help them, but only if you have strength to use." The revelation that they could help, that their well-being might actually serve a purpose beyond their own survival, changed something fundamental in the women. Lieutenant Morrison arranged for them to work with the Red Cross twice a week, writing letters in German that would be included in care packages, offering encouragement and hope to civilians receiving aid. They helped sort donations, pack boxes with powdered milk and canned goods, and assist with translation work for relief coordination. The work gave their meals meaning. When Marguerite ate breakfast now, she told herself she was building the strength to pack 50 boxes that day. When Anna consumed her lunch, she was fueling the energy to write 20 letters of hope. But the work also exposed them to more detailed information about Germany's collapse, and with that information came an agonizing question that had been building since their first meal of beef stew. What would happen when it was time to return home? The war in Europe had officially ended on May 8, just 2 months after their arrival at Camp Gordon. Repatriation discussions had begun for German prisoners across America. Male soldiers were already being processed for return, loaded onto ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic to a country that existed now only in ruins and starvation. For the women, the processing was slower, the logistics more complicated, but everyone understood it was coming. One evening in late June, the 38 women gathered in their barracks for a conversation they had all been avoiding. Elizabeth, who had regained enough strength to resume her natural leadership role, stood before them and spoke the truth they had all been thinking. "When we return to Germany," she said slowly, "we return to starvation. We have all read the reports. The situation has not improved. In many places, it has gotten worse. The cities are rubble. The farms are destroyed. The distribution systems have collapsed." She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We will be returning to the same hunger we escaped, except this time, we will remember what it feels like to be full." Anna, sitting on her cot with her knees drawn up to her chest, spoke next. "My mother wrote again. She said not to hurry home. She said there is nothing to come home to, that I would only be another mouth they cannot feed." Her voice was flat, emotionless, as if she had cried so much already that she had no tears left. "She told me if there was any way to stay in America, I should take it." Other women nodded, acknowledging they had received similar messages. Families who loved them were telling them not to return, because love sometimes meant accepting that survival required separation. Marguerite thought about her sister Heidi and her father, both growing weaker with each passing day. If she returned, she would share their fate. Within weeks, maybe months, the weight she had gained would melt away. The strength she had rebuilt would fade. She would become again the hollow-eyed, desperate woman who had arrived at Camp Gordon. And for what? So her family could watch her starve alongside them? So she could die in the same ruins that had claimed her mother? July 15, 1945. The day of repatriation had arrived with the inevitability of a season changing. Transport trucks sat waiting outside Camp Gordon, engines idling, ready to carry the German women to the port in Charleston, where ships would take them back across the Atlantic. The women had been awake since before dawn, packing the few belongings they had accumulated during their months in American captivity. The mood in the barracks was heavy and silent, each woman wrestling with thoughts she could barely articulate. They had been given new clothes for the journey, simple dresses donated by church groups because their old uniforms were too worn and too symbolic of a regime that no longer existed. Marguerite folded the dress she had been wearing, one that actually fit her now healthy frame, and placed it in the small bag she had been given. She looked around the barracks that had been home for 4 months, at the beds with their clean sheets and warm blankets, at the windows that let in Georgia sunlight, at the walls that had sheltered them while their bodies healed and their understanding of the world shifted. In a few hours, this would all be memory. She would board a ship and return to Hamburg, to her sister and father, to rubble and starvation, and a future that looked like nothing but gray despair. Lieutenant Morrison entered the barracks, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes betraying sadness. She had become more than a captor to these women. She had been their translator between two worlds, their advocate when they needed medical care or supplies for their Red Cross work, their proof that enemies could treat each other with dignity. "It is time," she said quietly in German. "The trucks are ready." The women stood slowly, picking up their bags, forming into a line with the automatic discipline of their military training. But then something unexpected happened. Anna Fisher, who had been so quiet and compliant throughout her captivity, stepped forward and spoke in clear English. "Lieutenant Morrison, I have question. Is it possible, is there any way, for prisoner to not return? To stay in America?" The question hung in the air like a hand grenade. Several other women gasped, shocked that someone had finally voiced what many had been thinking. Lieutenant Morrison looked surprised, then troubled. "Anna, you are not prisoners anymore. The war is over. You are being repatriated as enemy nationals, but you are free to return to your country and your families." Anna's voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. But what if my family tells me not to come? What if returning means dying when I could live? She pulled a letter from her pocket, her mother's latest correspondence, and held it out to the lieutenant. My mother says there is no food. She says I should stay here if I can. She released me from duty to return. Other women began pulling out similar letters, a chorus of desperate permissions from families who loved them enough to let them go. Marguerite found herself stepping forward as well, her hand shaking as she held up Heidi's most recent letter. Lieutenant Morrison stood in the barracks surrounded by 38 German women holding letters from families who had released to them from the obligation to return home. The officer's professional composure cracked, her eyes glistening as she looked at the desperate hope on their faces. She excused herself and returned 20 minutes later with Captain James Wheeler, the camp commander, a stern man whose expression revealed nothing. He listened as Lieutenant Morrison translated the women's request, his face carved from stone. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking in English, which the lieutenant translated carefully. "This is unprecedented," he said. "You were enemy combatants. The procedures call for immediate repatriation." But then his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "However, given the extraordinary circumstances in Germany and the documented requests from your families, I will contact the War Department for guidance. Until we receive instructions, repatriation is postponed." The relief in the barracks was palpable. It was not approval, not permission to stay permanently, but it was time, a precious gift of days or weeks where they would not have to board those ships. Over the following months, the bureaucratic process unfolded slowly. The War Department, overwhelmed with post-war logistics and uncertain how to handle German women who wanted to remain in America, passed the decision to the State Department. The State Department consulted with refugee organizations and church groups. Interviews were conducted, background checks completed, character references gathered from camp staff who had worked with the women. In October 1945, 7 months after that first meal of beef stew, Marguerite Schultz received official documentation. She had been granted permission to remain in the United States as a displaced person with a pathway to eventual citizenship. Anna Fisher received the same news, as did 23 other women from their group. 14 chose to return to Germany despite the hardships, feeling their duty to family outweighed their own survival. Elizabeth Hartmann was among those who returned, determined to use her restored health to help rebuild her shattered country. The farewell between those staying and those leaving was wrenching, but it was marked by understanding rather than judgment. Both groups were making choices they believed were right. Years later, Marguerite would speak at naturalization ceremonies, holding the small bag she had packed that July morning when she thought she was leaving America forever. She would tell new citizens about the beef stew that had seemed like a miracle, about the American soldiers who had fed their enemies, not out of obligation, but out of belief that all people deserved dignity. "I learned what America meant," she would say, "not from speeches or propaganda, but from a bowl of stew offered by enemy hands. I learned that America's strength was not in its weapons or its wealth, but in its capacity to see humanity, even in those it had defeated." Anna became a nurse, working at the same hospital where the camp doctor, who had first examined her malnourished body, eventually practiced. She never forgot the weight of hunger or the gift of abundance, and she spent her life ensuring others received the care she had been given. The beef stew had been just food, but it had also been a lesson about what kind of country America aspired to be.